Okay. Are we ready to begin? Yes. Okay, so that's what we'll do in that case. Hello, good evening. Very warm welcome to the springtime, and great to see you at this wonderful event, which is, of course, as you can see, is a book launch of a very, very much awaited book that we've all been sort of looking so forward to being in the world. So my name is Sumi Madhok, and I'm a professor of political theory and gender studies at the Department of Gender Studies, and also the head of department. And it's my great pleasure to chair this evening's book launch. I have to say, this is the first time that the book has made an entry into the university space, yes? So this is the first time you all get to see it. Yeah. Okay. All right, so here's what the event, you can see we've got a distinguished panel of speakers, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Okay, so we would have about 45 minutes or so of interventions by not 45 minutes each, but in total 45 minutes interventions by the speakers, and after which Marsha will respond to the interventions, and then we will open it up to Q&A, which is your chance to provide your responses to Marsha's wonderful book. So let me then, in that case, introduce you to the speakers. Our first speaker is Clare Hemmings, seated right there, next to Marsha. Marsha's right. Clare Hemmings is Professor of Feminist Theory in the LSE Department of Gender Studies. She works across feminist and queer studies, exploring the political and epistemological impact of the stories we tell about these fields. Her many books include Bisexual Spaces, Why Stories Matter, and Considering Emma Goldman. Why Stories Matter won the FWSA, which is the Feminist and Women's Studies Association, Book Award in 2012. And Hemmings' current work is on affect and temporality in anti-gender discourse and on family stories. And she's also the principal investigator of the AHRC and LSE KEI-funded research network, Transnational Anti-Gender Movements and Resistance Narratives and Interventions. Following Clare's intervention is Armine Ishkanian, who is the executive, who's right here next to me on my right, is executive director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity program at the LSE, and professor in the Department of Social Policy at the LSE. She also convenes the Politics of Inequality Research Group at the International Inequalities Institute. Her research examines the relationship between civil society, democracy, development, and the social. She's the author of many important journal articles, including 2 books titled Democracy Building and Civil Society in Armenia and The Big Society Debate, A New Agenda for Social Welfare. And finally, is Denisa, well, not actually finally, there's one more speaker after Denisa. Denisa Kostovicova is Associate Professor of Global Politics and the Director of the LSE Research on Southeast Europe at the European Institute at the school at the LSE. She's a scholar of conflict and peace processes with a particular interest in post-conflict reconstruction and transitional justice. Her latest book is titled Reconciliation by Stealth: How People Talk About War Crimes and Kosovo, the Politics of Identity and Space. She's also co-edited various volumes, including Rethinking Reconciliation and Transitional Justice After Conflict. Currently, she directs a major research program funded by the European Research Council titled Justice Interactions and Peace Building. And her academic and research and policy contributions have informed policy making across various international institutions, including the EU and the UN. Finally, now this is really finally, is Marsha Henry, the author of the book that we are launching. Marsha Henry is a professor at the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University in Belfast and visiting professor at the LSE Department of Gender Studies. Marsha's research is concerned with gendered and racialized politics of violence, militarization, global social development, international aid and intervention, and conflict, peace, and security. And all of these, as you can see, these wide-ranging interests is what she brings to bear in her book. In addition, she's published on the challenges of decolonial, intersectional, and feminist qualitative approaches, methodologies, and fieldwork. Some of you might know, but I'm sure all of you know that till very recently, Marsha was at the Department of Gender Studies, and where she, of course, led the very important course on gender knowledge and research practice, which is a testimony to, her brilliant methodological interventions. She is the author of several books, including the one that we are about to launch this evening, which is The End of Peacekeeping, Gender, Race, and Martial Politics of Intervention. So here is our panel. Please would you give them a very big hand.
Okay, thank you so very much, Sumi, for the warm introduction, and thank you very much for this, I have to say, bespoke panel of people who I burdened with the request to read my work and to speak on it. But it's also people at LSE who have very much been in dialogue with me in different parts of the book over the years. And so I'm so pleased that I'm getting to have this conversation with both the department that I was in, gender studies, and the wider LSE community, because I think that's one of the things that I miss about LSE. We always used to have these kind of cross-disciplinary, cross-departmental dialogues, but because it's so difficult, it's such a big university with so many activities each night. I've been told 50 events every single evening at LSE that you could possibly attend, so thank you very much for coming to mine. So yes, I have a very long acknowledgement section, and if you don't buy a book but you want to look at the acknowledgement section, it's weirdly at the very back of the book, and it's very long, and it could have been longer, but the proofreader was very angry with me because I kept sending back, could you please add this, could you please add this, could you please put this person's name, and then she was like, it's finished now. So yes, lots of thank yous. Thank you very much, Sumi and Armine, for hosting me this evening. And yes, anyway, there'll be lots of thanks throughout. Okay, so I want to give you a brief idea of the book, just some little snapshots of some of the arguments that I make, and so that you can get a sense of, what kind of grudges I end up outlining, the kind of, I sort of describe it a little bit as a sort of 20-year-long kvetch that I've been sort of complaining about and almost lyricizing about. But finally you have to, I think, put words to paper, so I did. So yes, so I want to just steal a little bit of my short time to play you this little trailer from this film that came out in 2021, just to give you a sense of how peacekeeping is represented in some ways. Very, very few Hollywood films, obviously, on this subject matter, but yes, so I hopefully know how to do this. Will that work? Yeah, maybe. Thank you. It's just a 1-minute trailer for this film on. Thanks.
Where is your commander? Where is your commander?
He's in a meeting with your general.
Civilian? Inside? Yes. How many? About 4,000 or 5,000. Soldiers?
No soldiers.
No soldiers.
I want inside.
Our commander is not here. I'm here. I want that. Okay. Wait. explain. Hadi.
Just a little brief indication of this film that I think really depicts some of the gendered, colonial, and militaristic undertones of peacekeeping that so rarely, I think, get outlined, get talked about, get discussed in the peacekeeping scholarship. So just so you know, this film is available on BBC iClaire at the moment. So if you're interested in watching the film, it's in full there, available, if you have a TV license. Sorry, Annie. There we go. Okay, so the book actually situates itself within this kind of very strange scholarship. I mean, this field of peacekeeping studies. And what I do is look at, and this is just a sample of the many books that have been written about different aspects of peacekeeping. And what I do is trace what kinds of topics or what kinds of critical issues come up in the earlier works and the ways in which they're left out in the later works. So the very last book published just a few years ago on the end there. There's two main fields, I guess, or two main sort of schools of thought in peacekeeping studies. There's the problem-solving literature and there's the critical approaches literature. And you can imagine that the 2000s characterized in the aftermath of various conflicts and with a range of peacekeeping missions being established. In the 2000s, there was an abundance of feminist, postcolonial, and critical race, anti-militarist approaches. But this work has rarely been acknowledged or incorporated into the mainstream scholarship. And so this has been sort of my project in doing this book, is to really look at the critical lenses, the theories that have been used, and why we've sort of left those behind in the peacekeeping scholarship. So what I argue in the book is that if we approach peacekeeping as an epistemic project, it's a project that constructs knowledge, both about peacekeeping as a practice and about peacekeepers as agents of that global governance institution and process. This knowledge is produced by, for, and through people, sites, and discourses. So what I ask is, how do we come to know about peacekeeping? How do we learn about peacekeeping? For the most part, I learned about it in a very different way than the majority of scholars in peacekeeping. I came to it through critical gender studies, not critical gender studies, that's the wrong field, through critical theories of feminist, postcolonial, intersectional theorists. And what I was very much influenced by, you'll see somewhere in there, in that book, in the list of books, there's a book by Shireen Razik, which was very influential to me, Dark Threats and White Nights. And in this book, Razik actually sets out this theory of peacekeeping as reflecting a global color line. And she uses that to look at examples of peacekeeping violence, and I extend this to not only look at peacekeeping violence as an example of colonial power projects, but as I use this concept as a metaphor for thinking about the global division of labor in peacekeeping, which kinds of soldiers are put into these contexts, what are the post-colonial and critical race politics behind that. So that's some of what I do with this critical work. So I look at the racial and colonial history of peacekeeping. I look at incidents of violence by peacekeepers committed against the peace kept. And I conclude that peacekeeping reflects and reproduces this global color line. If you look at the majority of peacekeepers, female peacekeepers, for example, they're almost exclusively from global south militaries. And some of the burdens that they're expected to take on, I'll explore a little bit more in perhaps in the Q&A, or they'll come up, I'm sure, in the responses to the book. So I take up this issue of the global color line. I also talk about the limits of gender. So again, in that earlier clip where I had that whole array of books, some of the early works by Cynthia Coburn and Dubravka Zarkov, for example, really get at the roots of the patriarchal project that is peacekeeping. But I think the contemporary take-up of gender analyses in peacekeeping really misses out on this early critical work. So you have, for example, traces of feminist standpoint theory in that early work of intersectionality. And I take up the concept of, Lugones as the coloniality of gender to actually look at these developments. So I argue that this singular approach by sort of incorporating women into peacekeeping, so you might have come across, advertisements or work that promotes the inclusion of women into militaries and into peacekeeping. And I look at this work and say, what's going on with gender here? How is gender working? And I think it generally works in the singular. It works in a binary fashion. And I can say more about that binary and the problems of that binary. And it works to reinforce this norm, this masculine soldiering norm. So this is some of the, you can see this even in the way in which, that's just taken from a UN peacekeeping site today. UN peacekeeping web pages often talk about including women in order to make operations more effective. Again, the long-standing literature on effectiveness and women's inclusion actually debunks this whole narrative. It doesn't matter whether you include women or not. It has no bearing on effectiveness actually at all. So that's some of the work that I do in the chapter mostly on gender. And then I look at the ways in which peacekeeping still is attached to and obsessed with martial means. So some of the examples in the book actually look at the ways in which peacekeepers are regulated by martial time, the way in which I as a researcher was also regulated by that time and ended up perpetuating and being complicit in it. Just this vehicle, so interesting that we have these sanitized images. If you have the time, you can go to the UN peacekeeping website and look at the gallery of, many 50 years of, 70 years of peacekeeping, because they just recently had their 70th anniversary, if you can have an anniversary for that kind of thing. The catalog of photographs, really fascinating. That nothing reflects the kind of martial basis of it, other than soldiers with weapons. But yeah, that's just to give you a sense of the ongoing nature of peacekeeping, which is that it's very much embedded in this martial culture and martial values. So I guess I sort of conclude that, once you unpack contemporary peacekeeping scholarship, you look at its attachments to patriarchy and patriarchal ideas, its legacy of colonialism that is still ever present in the kinds of images that are put onto peacekeeping web pages, the kinds of narratives that peacekeepers themselves perpetuate in the peacekeeping missions, and the kinds of narratives that the peacekept adopt themselves is also, I think, really indicative of the kinds of ways in which peacekeeping continues to be this, somebody suggested that the title of my book should be Peacekeeping Kills, and I thought, that would probably get me a lot more Google searches and attraction, but I'm not sure that it would be the most accurate title. But anyway, so I talk about in the penultimate chapter, I talk about some of the ways in which we could rethink peacekeeping, but also some of the ways in which we could recenter the peace kept in our discussions. So the final, I guess the final very light chapter, I'm sure people are gonna come back to me on this, is really about the end of peacekeeping. And I thought this was really fascinating, these two Twitter screenshots that or these two tweets that I got earlier today. Alison Phipps writes, you know, I think there's an error in the bottom part of the tweet, but writes, right now the closest we have to an international peacekeeping force that can prevent genocide are brave US campus protests, blockades of arms factories, etc. And anyway, it ends with, that's it. And I love the idea that we still have these attachments to peacekeeping, the idea of peacekeeping, its benign kind of connotations. We're still really attached to it, even as we're talking about genocide in the contemporary moment. And, you know, and then Jeffrey York wrote that the UN peacekeeping mission in Congo, known as MONUSCO, announced the end of its mission in South Kivu today. The blue flag has been lowered. Wow, it's really kind of very emotive. But he ends his tweet with "C'est fini," and I think that's in a way a kind of interesting an interesting paradox that we're in, where we keep seeing these attachments and this love for some notion of peacekeeping, whatever that may be, but we really need to see it's both practical and ideological, and so that's what I argue in the final chapter. Okay.
So, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm so delighted to be able to participate in this celebration of the publication of Marsha Henry's tour de force, End of Peacekeeping. Not only does it give me the opportunity to say a few words about the importance of this work, it also allows me to honour my friend and colleague of 15 years who left LSE this year for Queen's University, Belfast. We miss you, Marsha. You built the MSc Gender, Peace and Security programme. You took on leadership roles in the Centre for Women, Peace and Security and supervised several generations of PhD students, some of whom are here today. But aside from those formal roles, I miss your refusal to let power remain invisible, your tenacious coming back and back again and again to inequality, and your wild humour that would break through the hubris of institutional life at just the right moments. These are, of course, also qualities of the book. End of Peacekeeping is the culmination of decades of intervening in the gender, peace and security field to critique the gendered and racialised dynamics that structure peacekeeping. It's something of an understatement, I think, to note that this isn't a field that has a good track record in situating its practices as part of postcolonial global security regulation. It's not my field, but that's my sense. Indeed, one of the main arguments of the book is that it has spectacularly failed to account for racism as a structural frame that reproduces rather than ameliorates harm. Marsha's claim in this respect is a bold one, as all the best claims surely are, that peacekeeping is so riven with racial hierarchy that it must face its own end. I'll come back to what that end might look like, Marsha, in my question for you to consider. Reading the book, I'm reminded of that tenacious return and return to inequality, structural, inter and intra-community and intersubjective. That's what, to my mind, provides the motor of the book. A refusal to look away from inequality, and importantly for this launch at your home for 15 years, may I say that again, an understanding of that inequality as complex, intersectional and transnational. Your ability to bring together attention to sexism, racism, homophobia and globally distributed hierarchy in your analysis of peacekeeping practices is, to my mind, extraordinary. It's that commitment to calling out power that keeps you on track and that kept us on track. And humour. Well, perhaps surprisingly, given the topic of the book, there's plenty of that in End of Peacekeeping. Partly, it's the way you tell the stories that you weave through the text and that come from more than 2 decades of empirical research on the ground in Haiti, Liberia, Cyprus, and Kosovo, among other places. We can feel you having that awkward breakfast with people whose values you don't necessarily share. And we feel your openness in accepting the generosity of people you barely know, whose families take you in and feed you. Lots of food in this book, and lots of wry self-deprecation that makes your strong argument for examining how we come to know what peacekeeping is, as well as what it does, easier to swallow. It's also a cracking read. I wanted to raise one aspect of the book that I think really makes it stand out for me, and that's the ethics at the heart of the work. A feminist ethics, indeed, easily forgotten and easily displaced by trendier concerns, perhaps, with taking the right position or invoking the right keywords. A feminist ethics that is deeply rooted in your training in women's and gender studies back in the day and that we shared. And a feminist ethics that makes you deeply suspicious of other people's and your own claims to know the other fully at any one time, to paraphrase Abtabra. These ethical commitments lie in the careful attention you give, to my mind. Firstly, your deep attention to other people's work. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But despite knowing that contemporarily we're expected to make rather outlandish claims for our own brilliance, you are brilliant, by the way, you take time to locate your own originality in and through the work of other feminists who have paved the way for your work in the field. It's surprising how rare that is, even among feminist writers. In the first chapter, then, you insist that we have to revisit often overlooked work in gender, peace and security, expanding what that is in the process, in order to have trails we can follow. You cite Coburn and Zarkov's edited collection, The Post-War Moment, from 2002, Whitworth's Men, Militarism and UN Peacekeeping from 2004, Mazurana, Raven Roberts and Puppart's Gender, Conflict and Peacekeeping from 2005, and you read so beautifully and carefully with Razak's Dark Threats and White Nights, as you've also said, and Rubinstein's Peacekeeping Under Fire. And you do that with love and with honour. Secondly, your careful attention to the everyday navigations in your fieldwork and the labour of others. You tell us stories of Relia, John and Suzanne, among others, and speak of differences of opinion, struggling across languages, being welcomed, offered meals and care, and you always treat the people you meet with respect. Indeed, you say directly, quote, "What this fieldwork prompted was a desire to include those more subtle and moving moments into my overall book project in order to be able to witness and give space to those living in peacekeeping missions who fall under the radar." Unquote. So amazingly, although the book as a whole is deeply critical of peacekeeping mechanisms, histories, and practices, you never collapse people into those practices or people into those structures. In this sense, the ethical dimensions reside in that detail of your fieldwork, the everyday ways in which people connect as well as differ, and the gentle unearthing of stories of lives that are not your own. I am caught short reading this ethical work of honouring others, taking a look at my own work to check that I'm not making claims others have made without citing them, that I'm citing those feminist trailblazers properly, that I'm thinking with others rather than appropriating the care of others. And that's the point about feminist ethics. They're translatable and they generate ongoing conversations, not only between the author and their interlocutors, your interlocutors, but between feminist scholars like you and like me, who are doing our best to support one another to generate knowledge that struggles to do good in the world. And lastly, you come to the ethical conclusion that abolition is in the end the only way forward. You do so because of the evidence, because it's the right position to take. And you do so treading the paths of feminist writers and moving beyond them, listening to people and giving them care, but seeing what is to be seen. You look straight at peacekeeping, in other words, from a critical race and feminist perspective, and you come to the only conclusion that makes any sense to you. That's, of course, what feminists do. They come to difficult and uncomfortable conclusions that other people don't, and that speak out from that position of risk. That's why the work we do is undervalued, and we have to value it ourselves. And that's why the work is so important. And so, to my question for you, Marsha, you show us peacekeeping is far from a neutral or innocent practice. You situate it as part of coloniality, as part of global security that disadvantages the most vulnerable, and as a gendered and racialized practice that needs critical unpacking. You insist that the field needs to be radically rethought from the position of the peace kept. So I wonder, what does abolition look like to you? Can you tell us what some of its features are?
Thank you.
It's interesting that you ended with that question, Claire, because that's something I'm going to bring up as well. But let me begin by saying how pleased I am that we organized this event between the Department of Gender Studies and the Atlantic Fellows Program. And, you know, it's a program which brings together practitioners, researchers, and journalists and artists to think together at the LSE about how we create knowledge. And so I think, you know, grappling with this issue of epistemic project, I think is very, very important. So congratulations, Marsha, on this achievement. I'm so pleased, as I said, to be part of this panel, and it's great to see you back at the LSE. I wonder if, indeed, if you had called your book Peacekeeping Kills, you know, it would have been a bit more clickbaity, but yeah. But what I want to start with is what what I really appreciated about this book, and I think, you know, and then to link it to my own kind of thinking around peace building rather than peacekeeping, which I think is related. So I think, you know, what was very interesting to me and illuminating in your work was where you, as Claire already mentioned, was the epistemological discussions of what theories and whose work is foregrounded and whose is pushed to the margins or disappeared, to use your phrase, in peacekeeping studies. And I think this is a question that all of us grapple with in different fields and in different kind of theoretical traditions. But I think, you know, the point that you were making about why have certain, framings lost traction or never had any, made me reflect on the work of liberal peace building, because I think, in terms of the peacekeeping, it's part of that wider body of work, which again needs to be, kind of decolonized, criticized, kind of taken apart and interrogated from a feminist perspective, and to some extent has been, but I think, there's still more to go. So when I was thinking about what you were writing, in terms of your critique of peacekeeping, and I noticed you talk about the NGOs and the civil society actors within the background. They're not in the foreground, but it was very interesting because they are also these agents in these spaces of the peace building, peacekeeping, right? They are part of the wider aid industry. And so you have these similar dynamics of the local versus the international, the expat. And so, it was interesting to me to think about this. And I remember a panel you organized, maybe it was 5-6 years ago, called Aid 2. And the discussions we were having then, in terms of the critique of not just the NGOs, but also of the peacekeepers. And how far, so one of my questions is, how far have we come from that critique? Or are we, turning back on it? Because, thinking around some of the work that's been done around Me Too, and, it's separate, but again, these were very much linked kind of protesting critiques. And what we're seeing is, the kind of rolling back of some of those critiques by actors, and by kind of like, oh, well, this is all kind of the woke agenda. So I wanted to kind of bring that and to think through that in terms of some of those critiques that we were talking about back then. But I also found, what you were talking about in terms of the peacekeeping, the parallels and the logics and rationalities and governmentalities. And you focus on how there is this assumption that the peacekeepers are playing, quote unquote, a civilizing role, of them being impartial and objective versus the way in which the local populations of the quote unquote peace kept are seen and viewed. I appreciated how you talk about, this category of the peace kept, and while you are very critical, you explain why you use it despite it being a very patronizing, objectifying term or kind of concept in this context. And I also applaud you for making, as you said, the feminist killjoy intervention to tell the story that no one wants to hear about peacekeeping spaces and practices. But I think the book is making, it is making that intervention, and it is asking you a different question. So here, when you see or you portray the agency of the peacekeepers, they're not only, these actors with agency, but in fact, sometimes they're, they're portrayed as heroes, portrayed as self-sacrificing actors who are going in these enormously difficult spaces at great cost to themselves and so forth. So there are these similarities to the lionization, to the kind of the way that aid workers are sometimes talked about, which I think, again, needs to be interrogated. And I see that as part of this wider context of peace building, the liberal peace agenda that needs to be kind of unpicked. So here you bring that and you ask this question about, the agency in terms of how is it that, the agency, you say, why can the agency not be ascribed to the peace kept as much as it can be imputed to any global north person? So I think, this is something that is an important, where is the agency, and can we, through our work, through this work, provide them the agency? So one of the questions I have for you is, and I agree with you that in the existing accounts of the peace kept, they are ignored, excluded, forgotten, as you were putting up there, stigmatized, gaslit, abused, assaulted, cheated, and killed. So in what way can their voices be brought and be centered? Is it possible to co-produce work with them, right? So at AFSEE, we have a project where we're trying to think about how we co-create, co-produce work in a non-extractive manner by, collaborating with practitioners. So one of my colleagues is writing a book with former FARC combatants in Colombia in order to kind of produce that work. So I wanted to say, or ask you, is there work that's been written by people who would identify, or you would identify as peace kept, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be academic. It could be in other media. But so I wanted to kind of engage with you on that, about how do we bring those voices? Because I agree with you, this is an epistemological project. I agree with you entirely that peacekeeping is a knowledge project. So how do we know differently? How do we create that knowledge differently in order to challenge these dominant hegemonic assumptions? And so that's one of the questions. And the other question, as Clare asked, I agree entirely with your assertion that peacekeeping is colonial, it's patriarchal, it's militarist. What would an alternative to formal peacekeeping entail? What would that look like? Because, again, it's when you talk about abolition, whether it's abolition of peacekeeping or abolition of prisons or, defund the police, you're always asked, well, what would you replace it with? So I think, to my mind, that is the question that I wanted to ask you. And I think I will leave it there. But again, congratulations on a fantastic piece of work. You've given me so much to think about and reflect on, and I really appreciate what you've done.
So I should have been disruptive and challenge the order of speaking, because as a third contributor I'll be a little bit repetitive, as all the adjectives such as tour de force, bold, cracking read. I had a page turner, not cracking read. Have been used, but I think that, and we haven't really seen each other's notes, so I think some themes here are beginning to emerge. But I'll just start with a personal reflection. If you start from the back and look at the acknowledgements page, you will see Marsha's generosity and acknowledging people from whom she has learned. But I would also like to say that there are so many people who have learned from Marsha, from sort of sitting together, discussing together. And I haven't told you this before, but something has been bugging me for quite a few years now, and especially since we've started to work together, thanks to the Center for Women, Peace and Security. And that is whichever article I picked up that had to do with the topics of peacekeeping or conflict where it was relative, I've looked at the acknowledgements in the articles, and so many have mentioned you. And that was like really nice, but it was really also sort of I thought that there should be something bigger there, and I think this book does that. This is not your first book, this is not your academic piece, but I think it's really special because you could really see how you distilled all the thinking of these past, I don't want to mention the number of years and experience from the field, and it's there, and it kind of oozes from every single page. So congratulations, and I don't really think that you need a sexy title to make it sort of very notable and impactful. And this is actually how what I would like to say, that I do think that this work will be impactful in an academic way and also in for practice, as you get a sense from the first questions. So how did I read this book? So I think that Marsha urges us with this work to know peacekeeping. And I see such framing of the book as an invitation to us to question and shatter our settled ideas of what we think we know about peace building. And I think this is so cleverly, because we know the moment we think we know something, we stop being critical and we actually be complicit in practices that are not ethical. And you do that by helping us how to know peacekeeping, by giving us a critical analytical framework. you foreground gender, race, and military through this structural, intersectional, constitutive axis of power. And what you do as you take us through the book, you reveal peacekeeping to be a political project and a system implicated in oppression and violences in plural, even while it purports and presents to be exactly the opposite, right? To be an intervention in promoting equality and peace. And therefore, you could, I see that the whole book, as you travel through the pages, is the journey of revelation, which lays bare the systems of power which are underpinned by heterosexism, colonialism, racism, and militarism. And I really learned a lot by reading your book. But what I found very impressive is also not in terms of just what your goal and aim is here, to kind of unmask peacekeeping, but also how you achieve that goal. So the argument you present is nuanced and complex. You make a point that there is no single category or axis of oppression, and every category that you use in your book operates in multiple ways. So you could say that, this sounds a little to me like very messy and almost too complex. But actually you pull something really extraordinary, not just as an academic, but also as a writer. Because your prose is very elegant and very parsimonious. And it is quite an achievement, to take a complexity, but to make us understand it and to present it so elegantly and compellingly. So I'll just give you an example, sort of when you speak about the gender perspective, and you also mentioned that in your introductory notes, like you shatter those binaries, right? So even, if we sort of, our thinking has evolved, which I think is fantastic, in that when you talk about a young, sort of underage woman involved in a sexual relationship with a peacekeeper, you are saying this is not just about gender, this is about economic inequalities. So, so be aware of kind of binaries, right? In a sense that they can kind of limit your understanding of the complexities of the situations. And as Clare has mentioned, I mean, there are so many sort of very insightful, I shouldn't say stories, also ethnographic kind of insights that you give us, taking us through all these different places that you become to know from within, from Haiti, from Liberia, Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo. And I think that it's actually this sort of a combination of theoretical innovation and the theoretical density that kind of is interlaced with these stories, but they're not just stories for stories' sake, it's also quite instructive, that really makes the book a page turner, even for people like me who are sort of not really working either with your methodologies or in your field. But also I think what I think should be also noted, speaking about your work, that this is, as I see it, is not a piece of work that bases its radical stance by painting everyone with the same brush. And I think that's very important. And maybe this is not what you wanted to say, but I didn't think that you say peacekeeper equals bad. I didn't quite understand it in that way. Well, the way I read your work and your analysis, I think that you show some epistemic humility and compassion, because what I get from the book is that you acknowledge that not all peacekeepers are racists or abusers, but you help us understand how those, even those with the best intentions that you discuss in your book, are locked into peacekeeping as a system of oppression of others that they themselves do not recognize. Or know as such, I think. And this is where that epistemic dimension comes. But I also think that what makes your argument even more compelling is that you make some subtle observations which are, I think, very poignant and important. So, for example, when you talk about the need to recognize peacekeeping that is conceived as a global north project and an oppressive system visited upon the global south, you also sort of peel another layer of complexity when you tell us about peacekeepers from the global south for whom participating in peacekeeping is almost a form of emancipation, right? So it's very, very complex. And this is how as we sort of come to an end, you've completely sort of now destroyed, our understanding previous of peacekeeping. So lastly, again, the way I read your book is that framing peacekeeping as an epistemic project, you raised the question of knowers. Who are the knowers? And I think Clare and Armine have beautifully kind of remarked on this sort of positioning of your work in relation to the other scholars who work in your field. But your book spoke to me both as an academic and scholar of conflict and peace, but also it, if I may, also spoke to me as one of the key peace-kept. I kind of felt myself, and given my background is that I'm sort of partly from the Balkans. So when I read your book, I was actually almost sort of playing a mind game with myself, thinking, am I reading this as a scholar or as an academic on the one hand, and what is this telling me as someone who is in that kind of position as a peace kept? And I think what your book does masterfully, it allows one to understand things in a new way, whichever position or positionality you take when you read the book. Your book really made me reappreciate and reevaluate and re-understand some of the experiences that I myself have had while doing field work. For example, in the Balkans, where I had a situation where someone mistook me as being from the global north when I was a member of an international mission in one of the countries in the Balkans. This was in Macedonia, and I think that they did it on account of the institutional affiliation, because I think if you hear my accent or whatever, you would immediately understand, no, that I'm not from the global north, but anyway. But what they've done, they sort of thought that we were the same, and they started to speak to me about the local people in very racist terms, and that really took me, I just didn't understand how I was supposed to react in that interview, to say, oi, you are kind of like, this is not on, or to call her out, or very, very awkward situation. And sort of, before the end of the interview, the person then understood that I actually wasn't from the global north, that I was a local, but so when I read your work about, and the book about sort of this kind of systematic racist colonial way of thinking, that actually made me re-understand that episode that I had in the field. And as I said, the book also spoke to me powerfully as sort of one of the peace kept. And I think you totally understand that through our travels. We traveled together doing research in Bosnia, and those different positionalities sort of came through. But when I was reading those sections of the book, I really appreciated Marsha's understanding of the predicament of the peace kept, of the sense of de-agentification of the locals. And as we have observed over and over again, you know, it is those kind of the local knowledge, the local engineers, lawyers, techs, they all get sort of, you know, sidelined, and sort of the expertise is being brought in completely redundantly, and and all these people working sort of like taxi drivers or whatever. So so I thought it was really brave for you to propose that when you say that however bad the situation may be, you know, the peace kept may ultimately be better off without peacekeeping of the kind it is now. So I thought it was a very brave statement, because the situation of people before they become peace kept is so desperate that you know, they look to outside for help. So yeah, I mean, we can discuss that more, but that was something that I just kind of requires a little bit to kind of think through. So I will also end on a note that I see your book as an ethical project as well. I won't say it so eloquently as Clare, but I thought that it does really beautifully shows us how we need to know peacekeeping in a new way, right? And how we need to recognize the humiliation and, if you like, the suffering of the peace kept, which is completely something that you wouldn't expect to hear sort of going together. So I have one question, and that is, you are focusing on peacekeeping as an epistemic project, but I read your book and I read a lot about emotions in your book. So there is humiliation, there is anger, there is sadness, so lots of emotion there. So so my very short question to you is, how do you see the role of emotions in peacekeeping as an epistemic project, and is there any affective sides to it?
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so you can see from sort of the overlapping comments, but also, you know, the wide-ranging nature of the responses to Marsha's book, that what a productive and generative conversation we had. And actually that's, you know, that is what you know, brilliant books enable. They enable a wide-ranging conversation to be had because they are about so many different things all at the same time, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read, just so that bring back to everyone's attention the three questions that each of the speakers have kind of posed to you, Marsha. And I have to say, you don't have much time. These are very tough questions, but can I say, well, we'll give you about 7-8 minutes. That's it, okay? And after that, we will open it up to Q&A, because I'm sure there are lots and lots of you know, questions coming from the floor as well. So just to kind of sort of say, bring you back to, you would have seen that the range of responses and comments and the questions really were, you know, focusing on how beautifully and wonderfully and importantly and crucially steeped Marsha's work and the book is in feminist ethics, epistemology, methodology, and that already shifts it, right? That already shifts the field, because that's kind of, you know, shifting the field itself of peacekeeping by centering all of these things, but it also, of course, does two other things besides that, which is to kind of unfold for us a world, a set of attachments and global formations which are scaffolded by, held together by racial and colonial inequalities kept firmly in place through militarism, right? And that's what keeps it in place. That's the power behind all of it. But it also, having said so, that's the kind of work of demystification that the book does. But of course, it also has a vision for what that world would look like outside of all of this sort of, you know, the glues that keep it together, right? And so the questions that were asked of Marsha were very much about this heart, that vision, right? That world-making vision that the book offers us. And so the one question was, you know, abolition of peacekeeping, well, what would it look like? Yes, so Clare sort of asked you, what would that look like? And Armine was asking about, you know, how do we think about those people who've, you know, who've kind of, you know, the peace gift, the voices of the peace gift and the agency of the peace gift and their own work around this, and how do we center that work, right? How do we honor that work? How do we center that work so that they're not always the ones who are spoken about, right? That they're not, or that they also then get to be centered as, you know, Denisa reminds us that peace kept, that category of the peace kept is such an important, you know, it kind of, the centering work is so important because often they're all, again, just spoken about, right, and spoken of, but never the authors of their own story. And so therefore the question then, one of the things that Denisa was asking about was also about the emotions, the question of emotions, how you, I suppose it's about your writing of the book and your handling and, you know, and encountering that very difficult terrain of, you know, humiliation, of anger, of, you know, of feeling of feeling abandoned. I suppose that's one of the things that the world has forgotten about us, that they do not care about us, right? And so how do you deal with that? But also, I suppose, ethically showing up for the peace kept. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll start in reverse order since we're on the topic of emotions. So thank you very much. Thank you for reading the book. You might be the last three people to read this book. Sorry. No, I say that with the books being sold outside. But no, not very many people want to pick up a book about peacekeeping, but hopefully the End of Peacekeeping is enough of a title to attract you to it. So I think what I wanted to say about the emotions is, so I think my, you know, and this kind of connects with what Clare was saying in her comments on the book, you know, my education, I want to say training, I've stopped saying that because that's really, really very militaristic, but also what dogs undergo. So my education in gender studies has actually made me much more open to thinking about drawing on different sources. So you will have noticed that in the book, you know, I start one chapter with 2 excerpts from a poem, another chapter with, you know, field notes, fieldwork, diary, sort of paragraphs, and you know, I very much, and then the final with a sort of summary of the film clip that I showed you, and what you get from the film overall is, I think, and these various sources, you get a real feeling for the pain, the suffering, the shame, the confusion, the feigned or real innocence, as you might have potentially interpreted the very young Dutch peacekeepers who were depicted in that scene. So I guess all those emotions, I guess, are, you know, drove me in a way to put together the book. So they were very much a driving force, and I analyzed some of them in the book, but not all. So, I use them as a vehicle, but I think there's potentially a whole nother, I won't say book, but maybe article to explore about, peacekeeping itself and the narratives around peacekeeping very much capitalize on these kinds of emotions. The film is a kind of, the film is not without its problems. I mean, there's lots of people in the Balkans who, working in NGOs and in organizations who don't like the way in which the film depicts various individuals. But I think there's a whole field of, film analysis on conflict settings. So anyway, so I think, there's more work to be done, but I think they definitely were, I paid attention to them and I brought them out in the book whenever I could. So I think that's a really, it's a really important thing to acknowledge. So thank you for highlighting it, Denisa. To think about agency, I was rereading the book and it's very strange to reread your work. And I don't know if other people have this, maybe students have this when you reread your essays, when you edit them before you submit them, when you proofread them. But I often have an out-of-body kind of experience. Like I read it and I'm like, I don't remember being in this frame of mind and I don't understand how these words came out. I don't use those words, every day. So I think that we have so I think I had hoped actually to spend much more time talking about agency in the penultimate chapter, and I feel like I didn't. So it's something to pursue further. But I was motivated by stories of agents. Well, there was paradoxical accounts from the peace kept all the time about, they took up agency in this very complex way that I understood it, which was that they were courageous enough to very often tell you about the shortcomings of their own engagement in peacekeeping, but also to gently criticize peacekeeping. They knew they were dependent on peacekeeping, and yet they still articulated this complex relationship, sometimes dependency, sometimes in the case of Haiti, outright, they outrightly detested, as they referred to the peacekeeping mission in Haiti very often in derogatory terms. And they talked about the kinds of experiences of violence that they experienced from peacekeepers and from the institution. Similarly in Kosovo, the UNMIK was almost universally despised. So there was, but the military personnel were not necessarily treated in the same way. They were seen by some as saviors and so on. So I think the agency, I think I would like to bring it, I would like to explore it more. But I think that, one of the things that I try and do in regard to agency is to sort of just make a very simple argument that if you look at this, however many years of peacekeeping scholarship, you will see that even in the books where there's a compelling argument made about peacekeeping saving lives, the peace kept don't feature in any way. That you can actually make that compelling argument without paying any attention. I wouldn't, but you can, So some of the books that I critique are making this, very forceful moral and political argument about why we need peacekeeping, but the peace cap don't feature in it at all. So they're so I think that's super important to get in your peacekeeping education. And then what does abolition look like? Well, wow, that's, as you can see, there was it took me 5 and a bit chapters to come to that. And I've been struggling with it for 20 years, so I'm saying it, my hope is to radicalize everyone through this book into, like I used to do in my gender, race, and militarization class when I had the week on peacekeeping, I'd assign Razik's chapter or Razik's article, and over the years, students would often often tell me like, oh, I didn't realize Canada was like that, you know, rather than I didn't realize peacekeeping was like that. But then, you know, lots of, you know, as the years went on, you know, I felt like it was kind of my duty as a, you know, as at least half of me as a citizen of, you know, as a national citizen of Canada to do some of that work, right? Like to demystify that myth of the peacekeeping, you know, the quintessential peacekeeping nation. So I think like, so it's taken me quite a while to get to this. But you know, one of the things that is happening right now that enables me to think about what it looks like is some of the things that are happening right now on US college campuses, but also UK campuses, you know, in response to the ongoing genocide and the ongoing violence committed against Palestinians. You know, it's so obvious that the security sector, the police forces are not forces for good, you know, and I mean, you know, one of the things that I did was to turn to Crenshaw's work on Crenshaw's development of, you know, of extending intersectionality to this Say Her Name program, which is about articulating the names of Black women who have been killed by the police in the US. And this was actually, so it's in spaces like this, in interdisciplinary and feminist intersectional work, that I found the kind of courage to say, well, if we're talking about defunding the police in regard to the US and the UK, why are we not talking about defunding the military? Well, we are, of course, you know, lots of people have been. And if peacekeeping is based primarily on the military, why are we, you know, why is there this idea that, you know, we should be advocating for some kind of peacekeeping force in you know, in the Middle East right now? I just, you know, it kind of fills me with horror. So I think what an abolitionist future looks like is one in which we argue for demilitarizing those settings, with with the idea of ridding ourselves of the military completely in those spaces. But I take what I guess what might be considered reluctance in that final chapter to actually look at the practicalities of that dismantling is partly to do with the kind of the way in which Razik concludes her book from 2004, so 20 years ago, which was, you know, people kept responding to her book by saying, well, what should we do? What's the alternative? And I guess that she said then, as I would say now, that's kind of in a sense, not the wrong question, but, you know, if we dismantle this way of thinking, maybe, you know, maybe there, in some collective project, we can think about what kinds of responses peace building should take, pro-peace activities. It's certainly not, you know, it doesn't involve sending the police onto peaceful protests on pro-Palestinian support and solidarity. So if my book does anything towards imagining that abolitionist future, I think it has to keep all these other kinds of activities and moral and political commitments in mind. Thank you. Thank you, Marsha. Okay, so we have about, I'd say 17 minutes for Q&A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collect a round of questions. So I'm going to look around the room and see if I can see, and all you have to do is, yes, got my attention by simply just raising your hand. And I will collect your questions. So try so that we can get as many questions in as possible. So I'd say about 4 in the first round, and for Marsha to respond, just keep them really super brief, just questions only.
Okay, so I am now seeing, I'm seeing, I have two hands and I see a third one. And is there anyone else who wants to jump in, because we may not have time next time, so this is your chance, and I see one, right. So, okay, yes please, so you're right in front, and then there is a question I saw, yeah, there, number 2, and then there is a question I saw on this side, yes, you, and then Milena, thank you very much. So there are 4 questions, please, very briefly, if you could. By all means, you know, please do say who you are, just very briefly, just a minute. Thank you very much.
James Knight, member of the public. I just wondered if you could distill in a few words what and how a feminine perspective can bring to peacemaking, peacekeeping forces.
Thank you. Yes, please. And then there's a question there. No, just behind. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I'm Margot. So I just wanted to think about the state. Oh, hi, Marsha. Hi. I just wondered, obviously, towards the end, we were talking a little bit about peace and the state, and whether that could also, just got a question about whether we could ever fundamentally have a peaceful state or a demilitarized state, especially considering what's going on at the moment. And if possible, how can we then divorce peacekeeping as a demilitarized process without demilitarizing the UN and then eventually the state system itself? So, thank you.
Yes, please. Thank you. And then there's a question there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Jules. I'm a PhD student. I was wondering, in the beginning of your presentation, you said something about how maybe 20 years ago, some of the scholarship about peace building and peacekeeping, especially feminist scholarship, had a lot of critical contributions, and maybe some of that critical edge is lost a little bit along the way. I was wondering how you think that relates to the way in which gender training and feminist knowledge has become institutionalized and incorporated within this thing that it's critiquing. Especially, you know, in the context of, gender training for military and for police in the context of peace building, but also how a lot of academics or like the lines between the academic scholarship and the practitioners or the experts or the people who do the workshops and the training, how that is actually a very close field. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And Milena.
Hello, Marsha. Echoing what Claire said, we really miss you in LSE, and it's great to see you. I was a bit intrigued by the way you see the global color line being done or reproduced through peacekeeping. And I wanted to ask you if you directly engage with Du Bois' work, because in my understanding, he sees war and exploitation as being instruments to that establishment of white supremacy. And I was wondering if you're making that link to peacekeeping because you see it as a continuation of war, or because you see that exploitation happening in the political economy of peacekeeping.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, Marsha.
Okay. I miss your questions, Milena, from class. They were always so full of knowledge itself. Yeah, maybe I'll go in reverse, and then so I do talk a bit about the, I very briefly touch on the theorization of the color line, actually, but I take it from Razek's adaptation of Du Bois's concept. And so Razek uses it to conceptualize the civilizing mission, the colonial project of peacekeeping on a sort of macro scale. And I use it to do the same. But then I actually look at it in relation to the division of peacekeeping labor. And so I take it down on maybe perhaps another level or another layer that's similarly at the macro level as well as at a sort of micro level. Because I think about the way in which so this is not to expand on the Black Marxist and Black radical thinking, but to sort of give you, I guess, a little bit of an example. You know, I was just thinking about some of the obsession in the mainstream peacekeeping scholarship is around peacekeeping deaths. And so we know from the literature that there's a disproportionate number of peacekeepers from the global south who have been killed or who have died in the line of duty, so to speak. And so mainstream peacekeeping scholars, I think, generally disingenuously use that disproportionate death to remilitarize peacekeeping, to argue for remilitarizing peacekeeping. So I both take it as a, you know, as a sort of fact, as evidence of the racial dominance of the global north in humanitarian activities, but I also see it as a foil, you know, for, and not simply a foil. I don't want to instrumentalize the death of global south soldiers any more than those who are not soldiering, who die as a, you know, in peacekeeping context. But I guess I wanted to really look at whether there is genuine concern for this global inequality of labor. And then I guess the other example is really to think about how global south women have been, you know, this kind of answers the question about incorporating the feminine, or, you know, taking a feminist perspective on incorporating or including women. I think global south women, for example, have been hailed in a lot of the UN peacekeeping literature as kind of like, you know, as the sort of the way forward for peacekeeping. And, you know, as you saw on that slide, that, you know, when we include women, we become more effective. I don't know in any context where that has actually proven that the identity of a particular group of people makes a company or institution or organization more effective, because what actually makes militaries more effective is meeting operational military criteria. So global south women have been, you know, disproportionately in larger numbers represented in peacekeeping, and yet there's not really an account of how by the UN of how this mirrors, you know, the kind of work that standpoint theorists, for example, Patricia Hill Collins or Kim Crenshaw or others, for example, have pointed to in the US context. So yeah, and I've already mentioned Say Your Name, so I think that that's something that doesn't answer your question fully, but hopefully gives you a little bit about it. Your question about changes, about the changing nature of education, both in the university context as well as in policy and practitioner. You know, I guess I've been following this, but the person really who's written on this is Aiko Holvikivi, who some of you may know, colleague in the department. And her book is coming out in July, Fixing Gender, which is really about all those contradictions, the contradictions between the increasing femicrization of university spaces, of gender, peace and security policy contexts. You know, I'm complicit in a lot of this in establishing the Gender, Peace and Security program, which was called the Women, Peace and Security program here, because a lot of the tensions in that program and the public-facing aspects of that program have been about very different narratives and very different investments. So, you know, for example, I was asked to, you know, provide readings for a peacekeeping ministerial that was taking place. You know, can you provide some readings? So I provided like one really critical piece of work from me. I'm sure they never read it because it doesn't put forward any practical sort of plans. And so, and yeah, and I was telling somebody earlier today about, I was telling LSE fellows about the fact that a UN a UN advisor in New York told me that she didn't like my earlier book. I don't know what she's going to think of this book, but she told me once when we were meeting, yeah, I didn't really like your book. And I said, oh, why? And she said, yeah, I just didn't find it very useful. And so when I wrote the proposal for this book, I think Clare and Sumi looked at a draft of it and said, maybe you should tone down the bit about who you don't want to buy your book or who you don't want to read your book. And so I think, like, on the one hand, I think there is a paradox and a bit of a I want to have my cake and eat it too in the book about not wanting to engage with the UN, but then wanting to engage with the UN. So I think you've highlighted something, like there is this kind of feminist institutionalism kind of backdrop story that's going there. Okay. Margot, I don't know what to say about that. It's kind of like, I think it's actually a sort of shadow issue in the book, like I treat the UN in multiple ways that I think are sometimes problematic in the book. I treat it like as an institution, I treat it as an organization. It's kind of ephemeral at sometimes. I talk about it like a sort of scary monster. I talk about it as this very organized, sort of very rule-bound and very intentional kind of, so I think I often treat it like a proxy state, and I even say that in the book. I treat it like I call it a proxy state, but it so isn't, and there's so much complexity to the UN that makes it different than the state. So when I talk about abolition, I am really aiming my arguments at governments, and I've had this conversation with the Canadian government. Professor Tony Hastrup, who's at the University of Manchester, her and I actually did a session with the Canadian government about decolonizing peacekeeping and thinking about anti-racist work in that. It was kind of like, it was surprising, but at the end they were, some of the people participating in it, they were mostly like civil servants working for the Canadian government. Many of them were people of color who actually had, were keen to try and like push their colleagues. But in the end, it was kind of like, okay, well, how can we take this to the practice context, and then that's not where I'm skilled at offering solutions. But I think there is something in something more to be said about both the UN, its status as a governance mechanism, maybe that's the best way of saying it, and the role of states. And I hint at troop contributing countries. And one place that I hint at it is in relation to civil suits against states for peacekeeping violence and deaths under peace. So that the film, Corvadi's Aida, is actually based on a real life situation, and there was a successful suits against the Dutch government. You'll know about these, Margot, more than me. And then there's also been a successful case against the UN for the cholera epidemic, which is, I think, historically the first time that the UN has been held accountable on such a large scale. So yes, we could talk about that more if we have more time, but yes. And then in relation to the feminine and peacekeeping, maybe just to think about the what I think is problematic in the book around gender and peacekeeping, which I could have touched on a little bit, but is really this idea that, if we integrate women or if we include women, that somehow peacekeeping will somehow be softer, better, less colonial, and so on. And actually what we see is that, it really is a foil, as Belkin uses the term, as Aaron Belkin uses the term, it's a foil for empire. And he uses that term in relation to the US military and the ways in which the US military attempts to foreground sexual and gender-based violence against, against women within the military, within the ranks. And he sort of says, but actually if we look at, if we look at the larger picture, if we look at the histories of sexual violence against military personnel, we can actually expand this much more, and we can implicate it in the project of empire. And we can implicate it in relation to male soldiers as well. So there is a much larger sort of complexity to it. Yeah, so there's many things about the singular lens. There's a very heteronormative version of gender. But it's I have to just end on this note to say that, like, in many ways, it's a very easy project to dismantle peacekeeping. Like, it's sort of like dismantling the Tory party. Like, they give you lots of stuff every day. So I feel like, in a way, some of what I'm doing, you can also do. So I invite you to take that with you. If you can radicalize somebody by telling them, about the sort of moral and political failings of peacekeeping, then I've done my job in the book. Yeah.
Such a generous and such a generous and kind of welcoming, all welcoming note, actually, Marsha, to end our discussion on the book. I don't know about you, but actually I don't want this discussion to end. And Marsha has just told us that we mustn't end it, but we have to, because we only have this institutional space for a few more minutes. But I want to sort of say congratulations, Marsha. I want to say congratulations to our esteemed panelists for beautifully reading, thinking, and sitting with the book so magnificently. So thank you, and for helping launch it into the world. So I wanted to sort of say thank you to our wonderful panelists. It's actually a very special moment, in the history of books, right? Because so much of the book, as everyone has sort of said, panelists have said, Marsha said, was written here. So now I'm feeling like it was written here at the department, and so it just is so fitting that the book, actually the first launch of the book, is here, and that we get to welcome it into the world.
Yeah. Read the acknowledgements, weirdly at the back of the book.
Right. But I think that and in true Marsha kind of style and spirit, has sort of reminded us once again. We don't need reminding, but I think in the times that we live in, these occasions, these events, these moments remind us of the power of feminist scholarship and its ability to shift narratives and how we see the world. And I think that we have to see it in that light. And so therefore we are so grateful for the book. But also particularly myself, I'm particularly grateful actually to Marsha for reminding us that how all struggles are interconnected. Right? And this is actually a really powerful reminder in the time that we live in, that all our struggles are interconnected. And actually, and we have a long chain of feminist scholars and ancestors who have taught us this lesson, and it's a lesson that we mustn't forget. So thank you very much, and have a very good evening.